The fluorescent lights of Maggie's Route 74 diner hummed a monotonous tune, a familiar soundtrack to the Tuesday morning breakfast rush. The air hung thick with the mingled scents of frying bacon, burnt coffee, and Mrs. Rosemary's lavender perfume. Monica moved through the crowded aisles, a phantom in a faded blue uniform, her presence barely registered by the regulars. Mr. Jenkins, perched on his usual stool at the counter, nodded a silent greeting. Old M, Rosemary, her wrinkled hand clutching a rosary, offered a small, kind smile. Monica returned the gesture with a curt nod, her eyes fixed on the coffee pot she refilled. She navigated the narrow space with practiced ease, her movements precise and economical, as if conserving energy for a longer, unseen battle. Each step was a carefully calculated maneuver, a testament to a discipline forged in harsher environments than this small-town diner. Long, twisted lines ran down both her forearms. They looked like burns, the skin puckered and discolored, a stark contrast to the smooth, tan skin of her hands. They drew stares, whispers, and the occasional pointed question from a newcomer. Some said they were from a car wreck. Others whispered darker things. Drug use, jail time, self-harm. Monica never offered an explanation. The silence surrounding her past was a shield, a fragile barrier against the prying eyes and judgmental whispers of this small town. Inside, a bitter taste rose in her throat, familiar and unwelcome. She willed herself to ignore the glances, the murmured speculations. It's none of their business, she told herself, the mantra a dull ache in her chest. None of their damn business. The weight of their unspoken accusations pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She focused on the rhythm of her work, the clinking of mugs, the sizzle of the grill, anything to drown out the noise in her head. Earl, the cook, watched her from behind the sizzling grill, his face impassive. He'd seen the way the townsfolk looked at her, the mixture of curiosity and disdain in their eyes. He knew her story, or at least fragments of it, gleaned from hushed conversations and overheard phone calls. He knew enough to understand the burden she carried, the invisible wounds that ran deeper than the scars on her arms. But he also knew the stubborn set of her jaw, the quiet strength that emanated from her despite the whispers and stares. He respected her silence, her refusal to offer explanations or apologies for who she was. It was a silence born of pain, of experiences they couldn't begin to fathom. He flipped a burger, the greasy sizzle a momentary distraction from the tension that hung in the air. The bell above the door chimed, announcing a new arrival. Frank, a man built like a weathered oak tree, stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room before settling on an empty booth by the window. Monica automatically moved towards him, her notepad and pen held ready. She recited the specials without looking at him, her voice flat and emotionless. Coffee black, he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. He watched her as she moved away, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Something about the way she held herself, the tight set of her shoulders, the almost imperceptible tremor in her hands, spoke of a shared experience, a familiarity born of hardship. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of the men and women he'd served with, the ones who'd seen too much, carried too much. For young men swaggered into the diner, their laughter loud and boisterous, filling the small space with an unwelcome energy. They settled into a booth near the back, their eyes immediately drawn to Monica. "Hey, Scarface," one of them called out, his voice laced with a cruel amusement. His companion snickered. Monica stiffened, her hand tightening around the coffee pot she was carrying. Her knuckles turned white, the only outward sign of the turmoil brewing inside her. Ignore them, she told herself, her jaw clenching. Just ignore them. But the words were hollow, a flimsy shield against the rising tide of anger and humiliation. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the familiar sting of tears threatening to spill over. "Another round of beers, sweetheart," another one called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He gestured towards her arms with a feigned shudder. "Careful now, don't want to spill any on those battle wounds." The laughter erupted again, harsher this time, fueled by their own perceived wit and Monica's obvious discomfort. Frank watched the scene unfold, his eyes narrowing. He recognized the casual cruelty, the arrogance of youth, the careless disregard for another human being's pain. He saw the way Monica's shoulders slumped, the way her eyes flickered with a mixture of anger and resignation. He felt a familiar surge of anger, a protective instinct he hadn't realized he still possessed. He drained his coffee, the bitter taste a welcome contrast to the saccharine sweetness of their mockery. He rose from his booth, his movements slow but deliberate, and walked towards the group of young men. "You know," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through their laughter like a knife, "those battle wounds you're so amused by, they were earned saving lives. In Afghanistan, while you were probably still playing video games." He looked at Monica, his eyes filled with a quiet respect. She was a combat medic, pulled more men out of hell than you've probably ever met. He paused, letting his words sink in. "So next time you think about making fun of someone's scars, maybe you should ask yourself what you were doing while they were earning them." The young men stared at him, their faces flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. They mumbled apologies, their bravado quickly evaporating under the weight of his gaze. Frank nodded curtly, then turned and walked back to his booth, leaving them to stew in their own shame. Monica stood frozen, her eyes fixed on Frank's back, a strange mixture of gratitude and disbelief washing over her. The silence in the diner was heavy, charged with unspoken emotions. The clatter of plates and the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed amplified in the sudden stillness. The air, thick with the scent of bacon and coffee, now carried a faint metallic tang, the phantom scent of blood and gunpowder, a reminder of a life she'd tried so hard to leave behind. The midday sun cast long, hazy shadows across the checkered floor of Maggie's Route 74 diner. The air hung thick with the mingled scents of frying bacon, stale coffee, and the faint sweetness of Mrs. Rosemary's ever-present peach cobbler. Monica moved through the familiar choreography of her shift, her hand steady as she refilled Mr. Jenkins' coffee. The chipped ceramic mug, warm beneath her fingers, was a small, comforting constant in a world that felt perpetually off-kilter. Another day, another rotation, she thought, her gaze drifting towards the window, the endless ribbon of highway a stark reminder of the journeys she could no longer take. Each clink of cutlery, each hum of conversation, reverberated not just in the diner, but within the hollow chambers of her own heart. The bell above the door chimed, announcing a new arrival. An older man, his face weathered like sun-baked leather, stepped inside, a faded military cap perched atop his head. He moved with a quiet assurance, the kind that comes from years of discipline and an unspoken understanding of the world's harsher realities. Monica watched him choose a booth by the window, his movements precise, economical. He reminded her of someone she couldn't quite place, a ghost from a life she'd tried to bury. Just another weary traveler, she told herself, pushing down the unsettling flicker of recognition. "Coffee, black," he said, his voice a low rumble when she approached. His eyes, the color of faded denim, met hers briefly, then shifted to the view outside. There was a weariness in them, a depth that mirrored her own. Monica nodded, a small, tight movement. Coming right up. She turned away, the scars on her forearms throbbing with a dull ache, a phantom pain that mirrored the deeper wounds within. "Don't stare," she willed silently, feeling the familiar prickle of self-consciousness. Just get his coffee and move on. The diner, usually a refuge, suddenly felt suffocating, the mundane rhythm of its daily routine a jarring contrast to the silent screams that echoed in her memory. The coffee pot felt heavy in her hand, each drop that filled the chipped mug a small measure of the burden she carried. As she placed the cup before him, their fingers brushed momentarily. His touch was calloused, firm, yet surprisingly gentle. "Thanks," he murmured, his gaze still fixed on the highway. "You're welcome," Monica replied, her voice barely a whisper. She retreated to the counter, her heart beating a frantic tattoo against her ribs. Why did that touch feel familiar? She wondered, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. The momentary peace shattered with the boisterous arrival of 4 young men. They swaggered in, filling the diner with their loud laughter and boisterous pronouncements. The air, previously thick with the aroma of food, now crackled with their brash energy. Monica felt a familiar wave of dread wash over her. They were the kind of men who saw her scars not as marks of service, but as invitations for their crude jokes and misplaced pity. "Y'all got chicken fried steak?" one of them bellowed, slapping his hand on the counter. Earl, the cook, emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. "Sure do, son. Best in the county." His gaze flickered towards Monica, a silent acknowledgement of the tension that had settled over the diner. He knew. He always knew, but he never interfered. The young men settled into a booth, their laughter echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Monica felt their eyes on her, assessing, judging. She busied herself with wiping down the counter, her movements precise, deliberate, a shield against their scrutiny. "Hey, sweetheart," one of them called out, his voice laced with a condescending sweetness. "You new here?" Monica stiffened, her jaw clenching. She kept her gaze fixed on the counter, her hands gripping the damp cloth. "Ignore them," she told herself. "They're not worth it." The older man in the booth by the window stirred. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes now fixed on the group of young men. There was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a hardening of his gaze. "Just passing through," he said, his voice low but clear, cutting through the young men's laughter. "Name's Frank." The young men exchanged glances. "Frank, huh?" one of them sneered. "Well, Frank, you picked a real charming little spot to stop, especially with her serving the food." He jerked his head towards Monica, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. Frank's gaze remained steady, unwavering. He placed his coffee cup on the table, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. "This charming little spot happens to be in my hometown," he said, his voice laced with steel. "And the woman you're so quick to judge saved more lives in a single tour than you'll likely touch in your entire existence." The young men fell silent, their bravado momentarily extinguished. Monica, her back still turned, felt a wave of something akin to shock wash over her. "He knows," she thought, her heart pounding against her ribs. "But how?" Frank stood up, his movements deliberate, his presence suddenly commanding. "She was a combat medic in Afghanistan," he continued, his voice resonating with authority. "Patched up boys like you after they got themselves blown up, risked her own life to save theirs. Those scars you find so amusing? They're a testament to her courage, her sacrifice." The diner was utterly silent, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator. Monica slowly turned, her eyes meeting Frank's across the room. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, a shared understanding that transcended words. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. The young men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces flushed with shame. They mumbled apologies, their bravado replaced with a newfound awkwardness. Monica simply nodded, a small, tight movement. The words didn't matter. What mattered was that someone, finally, had seen her, truly seen her, not for her scars, but for the woman she was beneath them. The bell above the diner door chimed a discordant welcome, announcing the arrival of 4 young men. Monica, her hand instinctively brushing against the raised scar tissue that snaked along her forearm, registered their entrance with a familiar tightening in her chest. The grease sizzle from Earl's grill, the low hum of the refrigerator, the murmur of conversation between Mr. Jenkins and old Mrs. Rosemary all faded as the 4 settled into a booth, their boisterous laughter echoing through the small space of Maggie's Route 74. Monica took a deep breath, the scent of stale coffee and frying bacon clinging to the air like a shroud. She forced her lips into a practiced, neutral curve and walked towards their table, the worn linoleum cold beneath her thin-soled shoes. Each step felt heavy, as though she were wading through something thick and resistant. Just another order, just another table, she told herself, the mantra a thin shield against the wave of unease that threatened to engulf her. Get the order, serve the food, clear the table. In and out. Invisible. What can I get for y'all? She asked, her voice steady, carefully devoid of any emotion. It was a voice she'd honed over years, a voice that kept the world at bay. Their eyes, bright with a youthful, restless energy, swept over her, lingering a beat too long on the scars that marred her arms and neck. A silence fell over the booth, heavy and pregnant with unspoken words. Monica felt their gaze like a physical touch, each glance a small, sharp sting. Don't react, she commanded herself, her jaw clenching almost imperceptibly. Don't give them the satisfaction. The largest of the group, a young man with a crew cut and a sneer permanently etched onto his face, leaned forward. Damn, what happened to you? He asked, his voice laced with a mocking curiosity that grated on Monica's nerves. Meth lab or what? His friends erupted in laughter, the sound coarse and grating. Monica's stomach twisted into a tight knot. The diner, which moments before had been a haven of routine and familiarity, now felt like a suffocating cage. Every nerve ending screamed at her to flee, to disappear, to become one with the worn vinyl of the booth seats. But her feet remained rooted to the spot, her body rigid with a forced composure. Just coffee, please, she responded, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on a point just beyond their table. Ignore them. They're not worth it. Come on. I'm serious, the young man persisted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. That don't look like no accident. The laughter started again, fueled by his insinuation. Monica's knuckles turned white as she gripped her notepad, the cheap paper crinkling under the pressure. Her mind was a swirling vortex of anger, humiliation, and a deep, gnawing fatigue. Just coffee, she repeated silently, willing herself to remain impassive. Just coffee, and then they'll be gone. From the corner of her eye, she noticed a figure at the counter. An older man, his face weathered and lined, nursing a cup of coffee. He was watching the scene unfold, his eyes, a startlingly clear blue in the dim light of the diner, fixed on the group in the booth. There was something in his gaze that made Monica pause, a flicker of understanding, of recognition. It wasn't pity, she realized. It was something harder, something colder, something like anger. Frank watched the scene unfold with a growing unease that settled like a stone in his gut. He'd seen that look in the young waitress's eyes before, that carefully constructed mask of indifference that barely concealed the pain beneath. He'd worn that same mask himself, more times than he cared to remember. The casual cruelty of the young men, their blatant disregard for her dignity, stirred something deep within him, a primal sense of injustice that he couldn't ignore. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the bitter liquid doing little to soothe the burning anger that was rising in his chest. He'd come in for a quiet cup of coffee, a brief respite from the ghosts that haunted his own days. Now, the ghosts of another's pain were demanding his attention. He knew that look, the way her hand instinctively went to the scar tissue on her arm, the subtle flinch in her shoulders as their laughter washed over her. It wasn't a meth lab, he knew. It was something far worse, something that had etched itself onto her soul. He'd seen those scars before on the battlefield, on the faces of men and women who had stared death in the eye and lived to tell the tale. He knew the weight of those scars, the invisible burden they carried. He placed his cup on the counter, the clink of ceramic against formica, a sharp sound in the sudden lull in the young men's laughter. He pushed himself off the stool, his joints protesting with a dull ache, and walked towards their booth. The air crackled with an unspoken tension as he stopped before them, his shadow falling across their table. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice low and steady, each word a carefully placed stone in the foundation of his resolve. The young men looked up, their faces shifting from amusement to confusion, then to a flicker of unease. Frank met their gaze, his blue eyes unwavering. He could see the questions forming in their minds, the dawning realization that they had misjudged the situation and perhaps the man standing before them. "She earned those scars," he continued, his voice gaining strength, saving lives in Afghanistan. "She was a combat medic, patched up soldiers while under fire. So before you open your mouths again, think about what you're saying and who you're saying it to. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, broken only by the sizzle of the grill and the low hum of the refrigerator. The young men stared at him, their faces pale and uncertain. Monica stood frozen, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something else. Something that looked a lot like gratitude. The greasy aroma of frying bacon hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had settled over Maggie's Route 74. Monica's hands, scarred and calloused, tightened around the coffee pot. Each clink of ceramic against ceramic felt amplified, a percussion to the silent judgment in the diner. The four young men, their laughter now subsided, watched her with a strange mix of curiosity and unease. Their earlier bravado had cracked, revealing a flicker of something else beneath, perhaps uncertainty, perhaps the first seeds of shame. She avoided their eyes, her gaze fixed on the swirling black liquid as she refilled Mr. Jenkins' mug. "Just keep moving. Just get through this," she repeated internally, the mantra a fragile shield against the wave of humiliation that threatened to engulf her. Every nerve ending screamed for escape, for the anonymity of the small apartment where she could finally shed the weight of their stares. Frank, his coffee untouched, continued to hold their gaze. The diner's usual hum, the clatter of cutlery and the low murmur of conversations, seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the weight of his silence. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, the action somehow both casual and loaded with meaning. The bitter taste mirrored the resentment he felt simmering within him. He'd seen this kind of casual cruelty before, the kind that thrived on ignorance and the illusion of power. He'd seen it in the eyes of the enemy, and he'd seen it, with a chilling familiarity, in the eyes of those who were supposed to be his own. They don't know. They can't know, he thought, the image of his daughter, Sarah, flashing before his eyes. The memory, usually a source of comfort, now twisted into a sharp pang of anxiety. "You ever serve?" Frank's voice, though quiet, cut through the tense silence like a honed blade. The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. The young men shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Frank and each other. One of them, the one with the faded baseball cap, scoffed. "No, man, we ain't into that kind of thing." Monica's stomach clenched. She knew where this was going. The familiar script of dismissal, of being reduced to her scars, to the silent story they told. She braced herself for the inevitable wave of pity or, worse, the thinly veiled disgust that often followed. Frank's eyes narrowed, the lines around them deepening. "It's 19th Forward Support Battalion, Afghanistan. 2011. The words were precise, clipped, devoid of any emotion save for a steely undercurrent of something cold and hard. He watched their faces, searching for a flicker of recognition, a hint of understanding. He found nothing but blank confusion. He wasn't surprised. The young man with the baseball cap frowned. "What's that supposed to mean, old man?" The question, laced with youthful arrogance, grated on Frank's nerves. He could feel the pressure building in his chest, the familiar phantom ache from a shrapnel wound he'd received years ago. He took another slow sip of coffee, willing himself to remain calm, to choose his words carefully. "My daughter was in that unit." His voice was barely a whisper, but the words carried a weight that silenced the diner. Even Earl, the usually stoic cook, paused his frantic flipping of burgers to glance over at the table. Old M, Rosemary, her wrinkled hand clutching her rosary beads, sent a worried look in Monica's direction. Mr. Jenkins, bless his soul, continued to sip his coffee, seemingly oblivious to the charged atmosphere. Monica felt a jolt, a sudden surge of adrenaline. The mention of the 19th Forward Support Battalion, the specific year, it couldn't be a coincidence. She looked at Frank, really looked at him for the first time. The weathered lines on his face, the way he held himself, the haunted look in his eyes, it all clicked into place. Memories, long suppressed, flooded her consciousness. The chaos of the battlefield, the desperate fight for survival, the young woman with fiery red hair, clinging to life. The young men exchanged confused glances. "So, The one with the baseball cap finally mumbled. "What's that got to do with anything?" Frank's gaze locked onto Monica. "You were there?" he asked, his voice thick with unspoken emotion. Monica's throat constricted. She swallowed hard. The words caught somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "Yes," she whispered, the single syllable echoing in the sudden silence. The diner, once filled with the clatter and chatter of lunchtime, held its breath. The weight of the unspoken hung heavy in the air. The four young men stared at Monica, their faces a mixture of bewilderment and dawning comprehension. The bravado had completely vanished, replaced by a nervous fidgeting. They finally saw her, not as a scarred waitress, but as something more, something they couldn't quite grasp. Frank's hand trembled slightly as he reached across the table towards Monica. "You saved her life," he said, his voice cracking. "You saved my Sarah." The dam finally broke. Tears welled up in Monica's eyes, blurring her vision. She nodded, unable to speak. The weight of the past, the burden she had carried for so long, suddenly shared. In that moment, in the hushed reverence of Maggie's Route 74, Monica was no longer just a waitress with scars. She was a hero, a survivor, a daughter who had saved another daughter. And in the eyes of those who had judged her, a flicker of respect, of understanding, finally began to dawn. The greasy smell of frying bacon still hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the sudden, heavy silence that had fallen over Maggie's Route 74. The clatter of cutlery against plates, the low hum of conversation, even the rhythmic whir of the ceiling fan seemed to have vanished, absorbed by the weight of the unspoken. Monica stood by the counter, her hand still gripping the edge, knuckles bone-white. The coffee pot felt strangely warm against her chilled fingers. She hadn't noticed the trembling until Earl, the cook, gently took the pot from her, his touch surprisingly gentle. Her gaze flitted across the faces in the diner, each a study in varying shades of discomfort. Shame colored the cheeks of the young men, their earlier bravado replaced with a nervous shifting in their seats. Mr. Jenkins and old Ms. Rosemary, their usual cheerful expressions replaced by a somber understanding, looked at her with a newfound respect, a hesitant sympathy. "They know now." The thought echoed hollowly in Monica's mind. They finally see past the scars. Yet, the revelation, the sudden shift in the atmosphere, brought no sense of triumph, no surge of vindication. Instead, a cold emptiness spread within her, a familiar ache settling in her chest. This wasn't what she wanted. Not this awkward silence, these pitying glances. It was a different kind of scrutiny, a different kind of othering. Before, they had seen a scarred waitress, a subject of their cruel amusement. Now they saw a hero, a label just as limiting, just as reductive. They already had their story, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, the words directed more at herself than anyone else. Earl, his broad back turned to her as he busied himself with the grill, gave a barely perceptible nod. He knew. He had always known. He'd seen the way they looked at her, the whispers, the snickers. He'd seen her flinch, the way her hand instinctively went to her arm, tracing the raised lines beneath her sleeve. He'd seen the way she held herself, shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. But he'd never said a word. Every table, every day, she continued, her voice gaining a little strength, a touch of bitterness seeping in. Her gaze drifted back to the young men, still huddled together, their eyes avoiding hers. The silence pressed down on her, thick and suffocating. It was the same silence she'd experienced countless times before, but now it carried a different weight. Before, it was the silence of ignorance, of indifference. Now it was the silence of guilt, of uncomfortable awareness. Frank, the man who had spoken up for her, sat at his table, nursing his coffee. His eyes, though kind, held a weariness that mirrored her own. He had seen it too. The way people looked at her, the judgments they made based on the visible, the superficial. He understood. He had carried his own invisible scars, the ones etched on the soul. A sigh escaped Monica's lips, a shaky exhale of years of suppressed emotions. She ran a hand through her hair, pushing back the stray strands that had fallen across her face. The diner's fluorescent lights seemed to glare down at her, highlighting every imperfection, every flaw. The small space felt suddenly too confined, the air too thick to breathe. "I didn't come here to be pied, and I don't want a standing ovation," she said, her voice finally finding its steady rhythm, a quiet strength resonating in the hushed diner. She met Frank's gaze, a flicker of understanding passing between them. The weight of the past, the burden of unspoken words, the years of endured judgments, it all hung heavy in the air between them. One of the young men, the one who had been the loudest, the most boisterous, finally looked up. His eyes, no longer filled with arrogance, held a flicker of something akin to regret. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The others watched him, their expressions mirroring his own mixture of shame and uncertainty. Monica didn't need their apologies. Words wouldn't erase the years of stares, the whispers, the assumptions. Words couldn't mend the wounds, both visible and invisible. What she needed, what she craved, was something far more elusive, something far more profound. She needed them to see her, not as a hero or a victim, but simply as Monica, the waitress at Maggie's Route 74, a woman trying to navigate the complexities of life, one cup of coffee, one plate of eggs, one silent battle at a time. The bell above the door chimed, signaling the arrival of a new customer, breaking the spell that had held the diner captive. The sudden sound seemed to jolt everyone back to reality, the awkward silence gradually giving way to the low murmur of conversation, the clatter of dishes, the familiar rhythm of life at Maggie's. But something had shifted, something had changed. The air, though still thick with the scent of bacon and coffee, now carried a different weight, a heavier silence lingering beneath the surface. It was the silence of understanding, of unspoken acknowledgement, the silence of a story finally told, a truth finally revealed. And in that silence, Monica found a sliver of solace, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be different. The chipped Formica tabletop held the faint, sticky residue of spilled syrup, a testament to countless breakfasts served at Maggie's Route 74. Monica's hand, scarred tissue a pale roadmap against her tan skin, absently traced the outline of a coffee ring. The diner air, thick with the mingled scents of frying bacon and stale coffee, hung heavy, mirroring the tension that had only moments ago crackled like static electricity. Now a strange, fragile quiet had settled. The four young men, their bravado deflated, sat hunched over their untouched plates, their faces a mixture of shame and bewilderment. Frank, his weathered face etched with a sorrow that seemed to have aged him 10 years in as many minutes, stared into the depths of his lukewarm coffee. "Becky, she always wanted to be a medic," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. He looked up at Monica, his eyes red-rimmed. "Like you." He swallowed hard. "I didn't know Becky passed." The words seemed to catch in his throat, each syllable laden with the weight of unspoken grief. Monica's breath hitched. A wave of empathy, sharp and unexpected, washed over her. She recognized the hollow echo of loss in his voice, the same emptiness that resonated within her own chest. The carefully constructed walls she'd built around her heart, brick by painstaking brick, seemed to tremble. "Don't," a voice within her whispered. "Don't let them in." She had fought so hard to bury the memories, to lock them away in the deepest recesses of her mind. But Frank's words, his raw, unguarded grief, had chipped away at her defenses. To him, not used to being seen, she said, the words barely audible above the clatter of Earl's spatula against the griddle. Seen. Not stared at, not mocked, but truly seen. It was a foreign concept, a vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself in years. The scars on her arms seemed to throb beneath the thin fabric of her uniform. They were not just physical reminders of the war. They were a brand, marking her as different, as damaged. They were the reason she kept her head down, her gaze averted, her interactions brief and impersonal. They were the reason she chose the anonymity of Maggie's Route 74. The reason she preferred the silent company of the chipped formica and the greasy spoons to the scrutiny of the outside world. Frank's eyes, clouded with unshed tears, held a depth of understanding that startled her. He saw past the scars, past the carefully constructed facade of indifference. He saw the soldier beneath, the medic who had fought desperately to save lives, the woman who carried the weight of those she couldn't. He reached across the table, his hand hovering hesitantly over hers. He withdrew it before making contact, a silent acknowledgement of the invisible barrier she had erected around herself. "You were there," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "In Afghanistan." The explosion. He trailed off, unable to articulate the horrors he imagined she had witnessed. Monica closed her eyes, the images flashing behind her eyelids like a macabre slideshow. The dust, the screams, the smell of burning flesh. The frantic scramble to triage the wounded, the desperate fight against time and overwhelming odds. The faces of the fallen, etched forever in her memory. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the swirling patterns in the formica. "I was there," she confirmed, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. A profound silence descended upon the diner. Even Earl, usually a whirlwind of clatter and sizzle, stood motionless behind the counter, his spatula suspended mid-air. Mr. Jenkins and Old M. Rosemary, two of the diner's regulars, watched Monica with a newfound respect, their usual jovial banter replaced by a quiet solemnity. "You saved lives," Frank said, his voice regaining some of its strength. "My Becky, she wrote about you. The Angel of Kandahar, she called you." Monica's heart clenched. The Angel of Kandahar. The irony was almost unbearable. She felt anything but angelic. She carried the weight of her failures, the ghosts of those she couldn't save, like a shroud. She looked up at Frank, a flicker of something akin to gratitude in her eyes. "Don't assume you know someone's whole story just because you see one page," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. She looked at the young men, their faces now etched with a mixture of shame and dawning comprehension. "Treat people with dignity." Her gaze swept across the diner, encompassing Earl, Mr. Jenkins, Old M. Rosemary, and finally Frank. "Everyone carries their own battles, their own scars. You just don't always see them." The young men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier arrogance replaced by a palpable unease. One of them, the loudest of the group, mumbled an apology, his eyes avoiding Monica's gaze. The others followed suit, their words clumsy and inadequate, but nonetheless sincere. The tension in the diner began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of shared understanding. The clatter of plates and the murmur of conversations resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. The air was no longer heavy with judgment and prejudice, but with a quiet respect. Monica, no longer invisible, no longer a target for mockery, stood a little straighter, her shoulders relaxed, a glimmer of hope flickering in her eyes. The chipped formica tabletop, the greasy spoons, the scent of frying bacon, all the familiar elements of Maggie's Route 74 remained unchanged, yet the diner itself felt transformed. It was no longer just a place for coffee and greasy breakfasts. It had become a space where stories could be shared, where judgments could be challenged, and where, perhaps, healing could begin.